There is a quiet kind of person in this world. The one who steps into a room and immediately shrinks their presence. The one who softens every question, every need, every thought with the same fragile preface. Sorry, can I say something? It is not weakness, not incompetence, not shyness exactly. It is something older, something carried, a conflict built from years of learning that their voice arrives with weight, and that weight must be reduced before it touches anyone else. Many live this way without ever naming it. A life spent apologizing for taking up space long before they ever take it. This documentary traces the hidden psychology, the history, and the quiet ache behind one simple phrase, the apology spoken before the sentence. There is a pause that happens long before the sound, a small, nearly invisible hesitation. The brief moment when someone gathers their thoughts, shapes the edges of what they want to say, and then quietly questions whether their voice has the right to exist in the air at all. For the person who apologizes before speaking, this moment is not empty. It is full, dense with calculation, memory, and emotional mathematics, a soft kind of vigilance that works faster than consciousness. They feel the room before they speak into it. They measure the distance between themselves and others, sensing whether their words will land gently or disrupt the delicate emotional dust settled over the moment. Even when nothing is asked of them, the body prepares as if disturbance is inevitable. This internal ritual happens quickly. A tightening of the shoulders, a small exhale, a silent negotiation within themselves. Should I say it? Is it worth saying? Will they misunderstand? Will I be too much? Too loud? Too direct? Too inconvenient? For some, this happens in classrooms and offices. For others, in friendships, family conversations, or even in moments as simple as asking for the salt at dinner. But the pattern is the same. The thought forms clearly, yet the permission to voice it does not. And so, the reflex appears. A reflex so fast it feels natural, even though it was learned. Sorry, can I just... The apology arrives like a cushion, a soft pad placed under the words so they don't feel heavy when they fall. It is a quiet attempt to lighten themselves, to shrink the shape of their impact, to signal that they mean no harm. But beneath this apology lies something deeper, an emotional choreography composed over many years. Because for this kind of person, speaking is not simply communication. It is an act of risk assessment, an act of self-measurement, an act of ensuring safety, not just for others, but for their own sense of belonging. They do not want to disturb the waters, and so the apology becomes the paddle they use to part the surface before stepping in. Many people around them will never see this. They only hear the sorry, soft and habitual, slipping out like a breath. Most will assume it is politeness. Some will see it as insecurity. A few might grow frustrated, insisting there is nothing to apologize for. But inside, the story is more complex. There is an emotional intelligence here, a sensitivity to tone, to tension, to the slightest shift in another person's facial muscles or breathing pattern. This sensitivity functions like an internal radar, tuned to detect disappointment, irritation, or disapproval before it fully appears. And so they preempt it. They apologize before there is anything to forgive. They shrink before anyone asks them to. They soften the sound of their presence so no one has to adjust themselves around it. If you were to slow down this moment, to press your finger into the seconds before they speak, you would find a quiet war between desire and caution, a longing to express themselves balanced against an old instinct to stay small. It is not that they do not want to speak. They do. Their thoughts are often rich, perceptive, nuanced. But there is a fear, subtle but persistent, that their voice might cost someone else comfort. This is the hidden conflict, the knowledge that communication is necessary, yet believing their existence must be softened before entering the space between people. In these moments, time stretches. A sigh, a swallow, a tightening in the chest that feels like a question. When the words finally arrive, they are wrapped in apology, an attempt to make themselves easier to receive. But this first chapter is not about fixing anything. It is about witnessing. Slowing down enough to see the emotional physics inside a person who has learned that their voice must arrive with a cushion. This is the beginning of their story. A life lived on the edge of expression, always stepping gently, always measuring the air, always negotiating the simple act of speaking. Before the apology became a reflex, before it threaded itself into sentences like a quiet watermark, there was a childhood moment, or many moments, when the world first taught them that words could be dangerous. Sometimes the lesson was loud, sometimes it was silent, but it was always learned early, long before they had the language to explain it. For some, it began in a household where emotions were unpredictable, a place where the air could shift without warning, where the tone of a parent determined whether the day felt safe or sharp. In these environments, children learn quickly. What you say matters less than how it affects the person listening. So they watch. They study the micro-expressions, the tightening jaw, the subtle inhale before anger, the quiet withdrawal that feels like a door closing. They learn to anticipate, to read atmospheres, to soften themselves so the ground stays steady. And without knowing it, they begin constructing a belief that being careful is safer than being heard. But not all origins are rooted in chaos. Some begin in homes that appear gentle on the surface, homes where politeness is prized, where children are told to be good, be considerate, don't make a fuss. These are well-intentioned teachings, but for certain personalities, sensitive, observant, deeply empathetic, these messages embed themselves with unusual depth. What was meant as guidance becomes self-silencing. They start believing that taking up space equals taking something away from someone else, and so they apologize. Not for harm, but for existing in a way that might inconvenience. In other cases, the origin traces back to school, a moment when a teacher dismissed their question, a group of classmates who laughed when they spoke, a single sentence, "Don't interrupt." That's a silly idea. Speak up or don't speak at all, that carved itself into the soft clay of their younger self. Children don't interpret these moments neutrally. They absorb them. They shape themselves around them. They become careful with their voice, as if speaking is something that must be earned. There are quieter influences too. Growing up with louder siblings, being the mediator in family conflicts, having a parent who needed constant emotional reassurance, children adapt to survive emotionally, and surviving often means shrinking. Some learned to apologize before speaking because it kept the peace, others because it prevented disappointment, a few because it made them feel less visible, and invisibility felt safer than vulnerability. But perhaps the most overlooked origin comes from children who were praised only when they were compliant, easy, agreeable, the good kid, the quiet one, the one who didn't cause problems. They grew up believing that kindness required self-erasure, that pleasantness meant not intruding, that the most lovable version of themselves was the smallest one. Over time, these experiences do not remain isolated memories. They become patterns. The body learns them as instinct. The mind interprets them as truth. And the apology becomes a bridge, a way to cross into conversations without causing ripples. Even as adults, the old scripts follow them. They enter workplaces and friendships with the same emotional muscle memory. Careful steps, softened edges, quiet entrances. Most never trace the pattern back. They don't realize that the words, "Sorry, can I say something?" contain an entire history. But this chapter is not about blame. It is about understanding the landscape where the habit was first planted, how a young person, wanting safety or harmony, shaped themselves into someone careful. Their original intention was never to diminish themselves. It was to survive, to adapt, to keep connection intact in the only ways they knew. And so the habit grew with them quietly, faithfully, becoming a second language spoken beneath their breath. To understand the conflict inside the or apology, you must first understand the soil it grew from. A childhood where being small felt safer than being understood. A world where their voice had consequences they could not control. A beginning where silence seemed like protection, and apologizing felt like a gentle way to exist. By adulthood, the habit feels natural, automatic, a soft echo that slips into sentences without invitation. But beneath this reflex lies a complex psychological system, a network of emotional predictions, learned responses, and protective instincts quietly working in the background. To understand why someone apologizes before they speak, you must enter the mind at the exact moment it decides. I might be a threat, not a physical threat. A social one, the kind of threat that disrupts harmony, triggers disapproval, or risks rejection. For many, the brain interprets even small acts of expression through this lens. Psychologists describe it as a threat prediction loop. The nervous system scans the environment for signs of potential conflict, tightened posture, flat tone, delayed responses, and concludes that speaking may carry risk. This anticipation activates ancient survival instincts: fight, flight, freeze, and a fourth pattern less often named fawn. Fawning is the instinct to appease, to reduce oneself, to keep others comfortable as a way to maintain safety. The pre-apology is its linguistic form, a verbal lowering of the body, a gesture meant to keep the moment smooth. People who apologize before speaking often aren't aware of this physiological layer. They simply feel a subtle unease, a pressure behind the ribs, a sensation that something needs to be softened before they enter the space between people. This is not irrational. The brain's social circuits are wired to avoid exclusion. For early humans, losing connection was dangerous. Today, the brain interprets disapproval, frustration, or even imagined inconvenience as threats to belonging. So it compensates. A small apology becomes an emotional shield. Another element at play is self-effacement, not self-hatred, but a learned belief that others' needs deserve priority. People with this pattern tend to assess their own worth through their impact on others. If their words might disrupt or take space, they shrink them. It is not that they believe they are unimportant. It is that they believe others are more important. There is also rejection sensitivity, a trait in which the nervous system overinterprets subtle cues as potential signs of disapproval. A neutral face may look disappointed. A distracted voice may sound irritated. And so the apology slips out preemptively, a way to avoid the imagined rejection before it happens. For many, this pattern persists because it works. It prevents conflict. It preserves harmony. It maintains the sense of being easy to be around. The world often rewards smoothness, not needs, but the body keeps score over time. The habit can create a psychological split, the outer self that remains soft, agreeable and careful, and the inner self that holds words inside until they lose their shape. There is also a cognitive bias, the belief that speaking equals burden. Even when people around them say they're welcome, the internal assumption remains. My voice has weight, and that weight must be made lighter. In a scientific sense, the apology becomes a conditioned response to anticipated discomfort. But emotionally, it is something more tender, a gesture of self-protection disguised as courtesy. Those who live with this reflex often underestimate its complexity. They describe themselves as overly polite, not wanting to bother anyone, or just trying to be respectful. But their nervous system is doing far more. It is calculating social safety with the precision of a seismograph. Every apology is a data point. Every silence is an interpretation. Every softening of the voice is an effort to remain acceptable. The pre-apology might seem like a small linguistic habit, but psychologically, it functions as a strategy, a subtle, intelligent mechanism designed to reduce risk. This chapter is not about labeling the habit as unhealthy. It is about recognizing its depth, understanding that what looks like excessive politeness is often an entire defensive architecture, built from childhood lessons, shaped by fear, reinforced by experience. A system meant to protect, a system that worked, a system still running long after the danger is gone. There is a quiet tension that lives inside people who apologize before speaking, a tension so familiar that it feels like part of their personality, yet it is not personality. It is conflict, a private tug-of-war between two internal forces, the desire to be understood and the fear of being disruptive. This chapter takes place in the space between those forces, in the moments before a sentence forms fully, in the places where the body whispers one thing and the mind whispers another. Inside them, there is often a voice that knows what it wants to say, clear, confident, fully formed. It rises with certainty, a thought that deserves air. But before it reaches the surface, another force appears, a quiet hand placed over the mouth of the first voice, not silencing it entirely, just lowering it, just softening. The inner battle is subtle. It rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Someone may pause mid-sentence. Their eyes might flick downward. Their breath may shorten without notice. But internally, the conversation is complex. Part of them wants to speak plainly, to express the thought as it is, to trust that their presence doesn't need justification. Another part fears the consequences. What if it lands badly? What if it changes someone's mood? What if it sounds demanding? What if someone misreads their tone? This fear is not loud. Its power lies in its gentleness, a soft, persistent worry about impact, and so the apology becomes a compromise, a way to allow the thought through while cushioning the imagined consequences. But this compromise creates a fracture, a sense of living slightly behind oneself, as if each sentence must be filtered, edited, pre-smoothed before it is allowed to exist. Over time, this creates a strange emotional fatigue, not exhaustion from speaking, but exhaustion from the constant internal negotiation that happens before speaking. Many describe it as feeling split, one self wanting authenticity, another wanting safety. Neither wrong, neither unkind, just perpetually at odds. This inner conflict often shows up in relationships. They become the easy listener, the one who absorbs others' feelings before offering their own. Not because they lack thoughts, but because they weigh their words more heavily than most. They become the friend who says, "Sorry, I don't want to bother you, but," even when they are the one in pain. They become the partner who softens their needs until the needs barely resemble themselves. They become the co-worker who stays quiet in meetings and then apologizes when they finally speak. Inside, there may be frustration, not anger at others, but disappointment at themselves for shrinking. Again, yet this frustration rarely shows outwardly. It turns inward, becomes self-critique. Why can't I just say it? Why do I always do this? Why do I feel guilty for speaking? But guilt is only one side of the conflict. On the other side is longing. A longing to be able to enter conversations without the pre-apology. A longing to trust that their presence isn't intrusive. A longing to say what they mean without wrapping it in softness first. This longing is often quiet because naming it feels too bold. But it exists. The quiet ache of wanting to be received without shrinking first. Another layer of the inner battle is shame. Not shame for speaking, but shame for apologizing, again, despite wanting not to. It becomes a cycle. Apologize, regret, promise oneself to stop. Apologize again. A loop that reinforces the belief that they are somehow too much, simply for having words. And yet, beneath all of this, there is a truth rarely acknowledged. The conflict exists because they care. Because they are perceptive, because they are sensitive in the most human way, attuned to others' emotions, aware of the space they enter, mindful of the ripples they create. Their inner battle is not a flaw. It is evidence of emotional intelligence turned inward so sharply that it becomes self-limiting. This chapter is not about fixing that. It is about seeing it clearly. The gentle war between authenticity and caution, between being heard and being careful. It is about understanding the quiet courage it takes to speak at all when every word is filtered through fear and longing. Change rarely arrives with fireworks. For people who apologize before speaking, the turning point is almost always quiet, a soft realization that doesn't announce itself, but presses gently on the edges of awareness. It happens in small, ordinary moments. Moments so simple that, to anyone else, they look insignificant. But inside, something finally clicks. Maybe it happens during a conversation where they hear themselves apologize 3 times in 1 minute. Maybe someone responds with confusion. There's nothing to be sorry for. Maybe a friend gently notices, or a colleague pauses, or a loved one asks, "Why do you always say sorry before you talk?" Sometimes the shift comes from within, from a single second of emotional exhaustion, a weariness not from speaking, but from dimming themselves yet again. A tiredness that doesn't feel dramatic, just honest. The realization is rarely sudden. It begins with awareness, a subtle noticing of the pattern, the apology that slips out before the thought, the instinct to soften, the reflexive shrinking. For the first time, they hear it. They hear themselves, and the sound feels different. Not wrong, just revealing. It becomes clear that the sorry has less to do with politeness and more to do with fear. Fear of disruption, fear of judgment, fear of occupying emotional space. The turning point often involves a quiet question. Where did I learn that my voice needs permission? When did I start believing I was an inconvenience? What am I trying to protect? These questions do not demand answers. They simply open a door. Sometimes the shift happens during a moment of clarity, a conversation where they speak without apologizing first, and nothing bad happens. The room doesn't change, no one bristles, no one is harmed. The world stays intact. And in that moment, they feel something unfamiliar. Neutrality. A sense that their voice might just be ordinary, not dangerous, not intrusive, not heavy, just a voice. Other times, the shift arises from contrast. They hear someone else speak freely. Someone who asks questions without cushioning them, who shares thoughts without shrinking, who takes verbal space without signaling fear. And witnessing this ease feels like looking at a language they once knew, but somehow forgot. There is no envy in this, only recognition, a small reminder of a self that might still exist underneath the layers of apology. The real turning point is not behavioral, it is emotional. It is the moment when they realize the apology was not protecting them anymore. It was limiting them, not because they are weak, but because the circumstances that once required caution have long since changed. The body, however, remembers old atmospheres. It does not update itself easily, but awareness begins the update. It tells the nervous system, "You're safe now. You can exhale. You can speak without shrinking first." This shift is not the end of the habit. It is the beginning of curiosity, a soft questioning of the script they've been using for years. Sometimes, this new awareness creates a brief conflict, a moment of wanting to stop apologizing, but feeling the reflex rise anyway. This is normal. It is proof that the old pattern and the new understanding are beginning to meet, to interact, to rearrange themselves. This chapter is about that intersection, the quiet moment when the apology stops feeling invisible and starts feeling optional. A moment when something inside whispers, with gentle honesty, "Maybe I don't need to say sorry before I speak. Maybe I'm not a disruption. Maybe I've never been." And this whisper, small as it is, creates the first crack in the old armor, a crack that height can pass through, a crack that reminds them their voice belongs not because it is softened, but because it is human. The shift is not dramatic, but it is profound, a quiet beginning of a new way of inhabiting the world. Healing does not arrive as a sudden burst of confidence. For people who have spent years cushioning their presence with apology, reclaiming their voice is not about becoming louder or bolder or forceful. It is quieter than that, softer, more internal. It begins with something simple: permission, not from others, but from within. A slow, gentle understanding that their voice is allowed to exist without justification, without apology, without a softened doorway to slip through. At first, this feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Speaking without apology feels too direct, too exposed, as if stepping into sunlight after living in shade. The body hesitates, unsure if it is safe to stand fully in its own presence. The old habits don't disappear immediately. They rise naturally, a sorry forming on the tongue before any thought has fully bloomed. But now, something new is present. Awareness. A small observation. There it is again. Noticing the reflex becomes the first form of change. Over time, the body learns that apology is not required for connection, that speaking does not endanger the room, that sharing a thought does not fracture the air around it. Reclaiming the unapologized voice is not about removing softness. Softness is valuable. It is human. Healing is about removing fear from softness so the voice can remain gentle without being diminished. For some, this shift begins in conversations with safe people, people who listen without rushing, who respond with presence rather than impatience. In these spaces, the voice begins to stretch quietly, testing the possibility of speaking without shrinking. Other times, healing comes through solitude, writing thoughts without censoring them, hearing one's own internal voice without protective filters, learning the texture of one's truth without external pressure. What emerges is a subtle, internal recalibration, the understanding that self-expression does not need to be wrapped in apology to be valid. There is often grief in this process. Grief for the younger self who learned to shrink. Grief for the moments when thoughts remained unspoken. Grief for the connection that might have deepened had they felt safe enough to speak clearly. But grief is not the end of the story. It is the clearing that allows something new to grow. As they reclaim their voice, the world begins to feel different. Not because the world changed, but because the internal lens did. Conversations feel less like negotiations. Silence feels less like danger. Requests feel less like burdens. Needs feel less like intrusions. They begin to recognize that people can hold space for them. That speaking is not taking, it is participating. That being heard does not diminish anyone else. That occupying emotional space is not the same as overwhelming it. This understanding grows slowly, like a plant learning where the light is. A person who once apologized before every sentence might now pause instead, not out of fear, but out of thoughtfulness. The silence inside them softens, not with dread, but with presence. Their language shifts in small ways. Sorry, can I add something? Becomes, can I add something? Sorry, I just wanted to say. Becomes, I wanted to say. The sentence remains the same. Only the posture changes. And with this change, their relationships subtly shift too. People begin to see their clarity, their ideas, their emotional depth. Not because these qualities were newly created, but because they finally arrived without being diminished. Reclaiming the unapologized voice does not turn someone into a different version of themselves. It reveals the version that was always there, the one beneath the reflex, beneath the fear, beneath the belief that they needed permission to exist in conversations. Healing is not the removal of caution. It is the integration of it, the ability to be mindful without disappearing, sensitive without erasing, kind without silencing. What returns is not volume, but authenticity, not boldness, but presence. A voice that no longer apologizes for existing does not become louder, it becomes whole. In the end, the journey does not culminate in triumph. It settles into something quieter, a gentle return to a self that had been waiting beneath the layers of apology. A self that always existed, just not always permitted to appear fully. This chapter is not about transformation. It is about recognition, about coming home to a voice that was never broken, only hidden. There comes a moment, not dramatic, not cinematic, when a person who once apologized before speaking hears the sound of their own voice without the familiar tremble of justification. A moment when the words arrive simply, softly, without the preface that used to shield them. It feels like an exhale they never realized they'd been holding. A quiet settling in the chest, a sense of alignment, as if their internal world and external expression finally learned how to sit beside one another. The world does not change in these moments. The conversations remain ordinary. The people around them remain the same. But the internal landscape shifts. What once felt like a battlefield, a place of negotiation, caution, and emotional measurement, becomes steadier, kinder, more spacious. In this space, they discover something profound. Their voice is not a disruption. It is a presence, a human presence with shape and warmth, with history and meaning. They begin to notice how their sentences take up space, not in a way that overwhelms, but in a way that connects. How their thoughts carry weight, not the kind that burdens, but the kind that anchors. How their needs, once softened to near invisibility, carry a quiet dignity when spoken plainly. The return to self is not linear. Some days the old reflex comes back, a sorry slipping out before they realize it. But instead of shame or frustration, there is now understanding, compassion, a recognition that the apology once served a purpose, that it protected them before they knew other ways to feel safe. And so, the apology becomes something else. Not a reflex, not a shield, but a choice only used when it truly belongs. The voice, untangled from old fear, does not rush to fill silence. It rests there, comfortably. It trusts the pauses. It trusts the listener. It trusts itself. In this new relationship with expression, something else emerges. Presence. A groundedness that comes from no longer stepping sideways before stepping forward, from no longer folding oneself smaller out of habit. Presence is not loud, it is simply unhidden. This quiet unhiding changes the way they move through the world. They begin to enter rooms without scanning for danger. They begin to share ideas without shrinking first. They begin to ask questions without cushioning them. They begin to let their words land naturally, without rehearsing how soft or small they should be. People around them may notice a difference, but they may not be able to name it. It appears as a subtle clarity, a new steadiness in tone, an ease in their posture, a way of speaking that feels both gentle and whole. The truth is, the journey was never about becoming louder. It was about becoming honest, about removing the layers between the thought and the voice, about letting the self speak without apology for existing. And in this final chapter, there is a quiet realization. They were never asking permission to speak. They were asking permission to be. And now, slowly, carefully, with a softness that feels like truth, they give themselves that permission. No announcement, no grand revelation. Just a steady unfolding, a soft return to the person they always were. The one whose voice belongs, not because it is careful, not because it is small, but because it is theirs. In this return, the room feels different. The world feels wider. The self feels nearer. And the voice, finally, is home.